What's up, U.S. history? Welcome to the lecture on the New England colonies, 1620 to 1750. The first question we're going to explore is, where were the New England colonies? And I'm going to grab my pen here real quick. You'll notice that, we've got North America, the southern colonies, and then starting around here, Massachusetts, modern-day states of Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. Right? So, to get a better look, we see the modern-day state of Massachusetts. We see the initial settlement at Plymouth, Boston. We're talking about Kittery, Maine, Newport, Rhode Island. This is the area we're talking about. Colonial New England. So what were the colonies of New England? Okay, a few things you should know. First of all, unlike the South, unlike Virginia, where there were large plantations separated by miles and miles and miles, these were small, compact villages of farming communities, okay, with a village green, a meeting house, public schools. Nobody had to pay for school in New England, in colonial New England, and or I should rather say they all paid for school. It was a public good. But they were clustered close together, just like a common New England village, okay, which is very different from the Virginia colonies. There were a lot more families than in the Virginia colonies. People came with full families rather than just men coming to strike it rich. The Puritan families came here to settle, and they brought their families with them. Again, as it shows here, the average age of marriage for women was 22, and for men it was 27. This average represents the fact that, sometimes they were married more than once depending on mortality. But generally, they didn't marry super young, as is popular perception. An average of about 6 children per family. And this was really one of the first times in English society that grandparents were actually part of the family. Up until here, grandparents, people didn't live long enough for there to be grandparents within the extended family. So stable families equals stable communities. Okay, stable, orderly communities. Order was also kept by patriarchy, so there was definitely an authoritarian male father figure. The men really ruled the roost. If you were a woman, you really didn't have any rights necessarily. You couldn't own property. You couldn't testify in court. It was a pretty male-dominated society. Let's see. There was a low mortality rate. So, people in New England lived on average about 10 to 15 years longer than they did in England. Okay? And they lived about 30 years longer than the average person in the Virginia colonies. So it was a good, generally in terms of life, in terms of mortality, it was a good place to be. The next question is, who founded these colonies and why? Okay, historians like to split these variables up into push and pull. Okay, so there's certain elements that pulled people to the American colonies, and there's certain variables that pushed these people to come. In terms of the pull, the things that drew people to the American colonies was, number one, religious freedom and economic opportunity. These are two of the biggies. Religious freedom, to some degree, political freedom. But what this meant was, just because they were coming here to be free to practice their own religion does not mean that the religion that they proposed gave everybody else the freedom to practice their religion. That's what this is for. Even some of this freedom included freedom to prosecute or persecute others, okay? And this was religious freedom for some, okay? You needed to be of the religion to have the freedom. And we'll talk more about that later. But they also came for economic opportunity, for sure. Some of the push factors. So they were pushed out because of severe religious persecution, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So, but they were also pushed out because of political persecution. In Europe, in England, there were constant battles between the king, the king's parliament, which was similar to our Congress, and the commoners. Okay, constant fights. There was a civil war, there was a revolution, and there was a lot of political turmoil. And some of these people wanted to flee that political turmoil. Number 3 is the enclosure movement. So the enclosure movement was basically when the nobility in Europe, or in England in particular, realized that it was actually just as profitable to have one person with a bunch of sheep than it would be to have 10 farmers. Okay, just as profitable for them. And this occurred as a result of the Black Plague. The Black Plague took away a lot of the laborers, There weren't as many farmers for the nobility to use, and they needed a stable source of income. And they started shepherding. They started raising sheep. But as the population came back to its natural levels, those people had no place to go. Okay, the nobility they were making plenty of money, if not more money, raising sheep, and they didn't need farmers anymore. So this led to the rise of a large, propertyless, very poor white working class in England with nothing to do, and many of these people were the ones that came to the Americas. Okay, there was also at various points economic recession, severe economic recession, which would lead to debt. And back in those days, if you were in debt, you didn't just get a bad credit score. You could be hanged. You could be imprisoned for a long period of time. And that goes to the harsh laws as well. Hopefully, escaping some of those harsh laws, and perhaps to escape imprisonment. Many people were given the choice if they stole something of either going to the Americas and working, or going into an English prison. And it was a pretty clear choice for most of them. Now, by far, one of the variables that we hear the most about when it comes to New England is religious persecution. The Pilgrims were coming to America to flee religious persecution, and that is in fact true to some degree. And to really understand what this means, you really need to understand the English Reformation. Okay, the English Reformation. So, what was the English Reformation? In a nutshell, the English Reformation caused the creation, or led to the creation, of the English Church, the Church of England. Okay, and the people that believe in the Church of England are known as Anglicans. Okay, Anglo is the root, a similar root of England. So they're known as Anglicans. And there had already been turmoil, and the Protestant Reformation had already occurred. People had already challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. And now King Henry VIII, pictured here with his 6 wives, he had a problem. He was married to Catherine of Aragon from Spain out of political necessity, and he decided that she wasn't giving him a male heir. And he wanted to have his marriage annulled. Under Catholic law, you can't get a divorce. So he wanted to get it annulled, which meant that the marriage was never real in the first place. The Pope would not let him have an annulment. So what he did was, this is another picture of his 6 wives, a little more modern view. So what he did was, he actually had, he actually said, well, if you're not going to give me an annulment, then I no longer recognize you as the head of the church. And in fact, what he did was he placed himself at the head of the church. And I'm going to skip ahead. So basically, instead of the Pope, King Henry VIII becomes the head of the Anglican Church. Most of the church traditions remain the same. The church is pretty much the same church, the same hierarchy, the same traditions, the same rituals. The only difference, really, was that the King of England is now the head of the church rather than a Pope. Okay? So the first thing he did was he got an annulment, and then he proceeded to marry more and more women trying to get that male heir, and he had many of them executed. And this is a little chart of his 6 marriages and what happened to them and why. Okay, and then a funny cartoon. Oops, I'll go back here. A funny cartoon about one of the worst jobs you could ever have. Henry VIII's 6th wife. And here he's got some marks on his bedpost, implying that she may be number, get rid of that. She may be number 6. So, King Henry VIII, he establishes the Church of England, right? But in Europe, there was another guy named John Calvin who had his own differences in opinion with the Catholic Church. He felt the Catholic Church was much too corrupt, and much too large, and much too institutionalized, much too political, and he had a very powerful impact on people. His theory of predestination said that God had predestined everybody's life. Okay, God had determined already who was going to heaven and who was not. Okay, and if you were among the elect, the people that were going to go to heaven, you would be given signs of God's grace. And if you lived in accordance to God's rules, you would in fact go to heaven. You could be a member of the elect and turn and decide to shun God, and you would go to either purgatory or hell. So the good news is, if you're a member of the elect, you still need to do good works to get into heaven. But if you're not a member of the elect, then there's really nothing you can do. This actually led to a lot of this influenced a lot of people, especially very highly pious people. And there were members of the Anglican Church who felt that King Henry's reforms did not go far enough, right? He basically just kept the institution and the structure of the Catholic Church, which they felt was unholy and corrupt. So you have a group of people known as the Puritans that want to purify the Church of England. Okay, that's the way to remember it. So Puritan.
All right. So that was a high school lecture about the New England colonies, and if you think that was too challenging, I can find something different. I tried to not do something that I've done before, and there's a few things that I have that we did in class I could show you. But if you want like a TED Talks, I could do that. We did TED Talks a few times, but I found that although I understand the message, I have a hard time interpreting the message. Because I also don't know the appropriate registry or other ways to say something except for almost dumbing it down. And that's an awful thing to say, but it's something that I've been struggling with for a long time. So yeah, just look at that. If you want something different, I'll find something different. All right, thank you.